This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, dedicated to promoting young American pianists and making Chopin's music accessible to all. Just as Chopin's music has held up over the ages, particular recordings of Chopin's works have also stood the test of time. Case in point, it's now been 75 years since pianist Dinu Lipatti produced his legendary studio recording of the Chopin waltzes. And to this day, it is regarded by many critics as the reference recording. And yet, what is widely considered as the best recording of the waltzes ever made might not even showcase Lipatti at his best. At least, not according to Mark Ainley. Creator of the Pianophiles Facebook group and YouTube channel, Mark Ainley has earned a reputation as one of today's leading experts on historical piano recordings through his archival work on many great pianists of the early 20th century. In particular, Mark has done more for Dinu Lipatti's legacy than perhaps anyone else through his intrepid pursuits of previously unearthed Lipatti recordings over the past few decades. So it was especially insightful to interview Mark on a recent video call about Lipatti's multiple recorded performances of Chopin's waltzes. It was an emotional conversation, given that the waltzes were a mainstay of Lipatti's performing career, which was tragically cut short in 1950. Indeed, Dinu Lipatti's waltz discography serves as a kind of chronicle of his own deteriorating health, a story few can tell like Mark.
Dinu Lipatti is one of the most respected pianists of his generation and also all subsequent generations. And he died in 1950 at the age of 33 of Hodgkin's disease. And even during his lifetime, he had a following that was quite unique in that pianists and musicians of very different sensibilities all had universal admiration for him. So you would have pianists, legends, like Courtauld, Schnabel, Edwin Fischer, Clara Haskell, Wilhelm Backhaus, all of whom played radically differently, and all of whom adored him. And conductors like Furtwängler and Karajan, very as different as you can get. And they all thought he was what Poulenc called an artist of divine spirituality. I think that Lipatti's discography hasn't served him well in a certain way because of the repertoire choices. Because the prevailing narrative about Lipatti has been, he was this poor, ill pianist who, not poor financially, but, it's this very sad story, this Hollywood-esque story of this great artist who is revered by all the great musicians, but he had this debilitating illness, and at his last recital, he was too weak to play the final Chopin waltz that he had programmed, and he played Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring instead, and 10 weeks later he was dead, So it's really melodramatic. And it's all very true, except that when he was in good health, his playing was actually really daring. And so you listen to that Alvarado del Gracioso, and you're like, wait a second, Horowitz would be jealous of this kind of fingerwork, and those glissandi, it's completely off the charts. It was hearing that recording, which had very little circulation in North America. So pianophiles like yourself would have had access, but the average music listener didn't have access to that recording very much. It wasn't quite the frail, weak, pristine image that we might conjure up. Hearing that narrative and hearing some of the recordings that were made when he wasn't as strong. He recorded one of the first, possibly the first post-war recording of the B minor sonata. So that was actually in his very few visits to London. He lived in Switzerland, recording at Abbey Road on this amazing piano that they had there that was, used by Courtauld, Schnabel, Fischer, and all of those greats. He recorded Chopin's B minor sonata, and that won a Grand Prix du Disque. And it's a really bold, imaginative, grand interpretation. It's very modern in a way. Lipatti recorded the complete waltzes in 1950, and so that was what was released. And it's an amazing cycle. It's considered the reference recording and has been for 70 plus years. And Lipatti was also a more daring, futuristic kind of pianist that had a foot in that romantic sensibility, but was also very much grounded in respect for the text while also being individual. It's almost paradoxical because, you could take dictation from his playing and write down the score and it would be almost precise. And yet you listen to his playing and within 3 notes, you can say this is Lipatti. He really does have a very distinctive character. So he's paradoxically individual and stepping back and allowing the music to speak for itself.
I wanted to compare my favorite waltz from since I was a kid, Opus 34 number 1 in A flat. There's 2 recordings of Lipatti, one from 1947 and one from 1950. The 50 is the famous studio recording. But I thought we could lean more on the earlier one, Mark, and we will play a little comparison of the beginning. And I wonder, which recording would you like to hear first as we do our side-by-side? And you can maybe give us a little commentary on what we're hearing from each.
Why don't we start with the famous 1950 version, and maybe we'll just hear the opening. One of the things I suggest listening to is this timing as he builds up. There's these famous da 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 da. His timing here, the voicing of the chords and the rhythm and the impulse, and there's very, very interesting, I think quite radical difference between his 1950 reading and the much less known 1947 version.
That was the 1950 studio recording. There's the first minute of Opus 34 number 1 in A flat waltz by Chopin.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's pristine. That's the thing with Lipatti, the clarity. And his producer, Walter Legg, was a legendary one, was married to Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, was the head honcho at EMI for quite a while. And he said that Lipatti was the cleanest pianist he'd ever worked with. There's never a smudged passage. Pedal is only used for nuance, not to create a haze and cover anything up. His articulation is always crystal clear, and you can hear multiple voices. So you hear secondary voices, but they remain secondary. So it's not like what Alan Walker was saying in an earlier one of your episodes where, folks are creating, some of those arch romantics would, create, it seemed like, bring out voices that weren't really there. I think a lot of them really are there, but Lipatti prioritizes so beautifully, and he voices such that it almost sounds like there's different instruments or that there's more than one piano, and you hear everything so clearly. And the same came whenever he made a change to the text. Nobody notices. People will always comment on whenever other people make changes to the text. I've never seen anybody comment on the changes that Lipatti makes to the text. And he actually told one of his students, who told me, that he said, when you're well behaved and you're well brought up, you can put your feet on the table and nobody's going to really notice. And that's what he was like. Whatever he does, it's just been so well thought through and so carefully done that you're just like, okay.
If I could go back in time and design a Lipatti album cover, it would definitely be him with his feet on a table. Here's the same waltz from 3 years earlier, except we're going to continue this one all the way through. So let's preface it a bit more.
So here he's in London. He's in the amazing EMI studios with this incredible Steinway number 299 that was used by all these great artists. He was in pretty good health overall. He was having symptoms, but at this point, the illness had not really taken its grip. It wasn't as life-threatening as it was when he made his 1950 version. So here we are that Lipatti is very excited, I think, because his name is starting to get out there. He's recording for a very prestigious label. His Chopin sonata from 6 months earlier was getting a lot of attention. And he's recording in amazing conditions and pretty good health, this Chopin waltz with a very, very different kind of approach. When you hear those chords that I sang earlier, that da 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 da, in the earlier version, we hear him slow down before he gets to the final one. Here he does exactly the opposite. He speeds up. So there's a very, very different approach in sensibility. And what you'll hear also, because the EMI studio was much better mic'd, we hear a rich bass sonority and reverberance and the tremendous power as well that Lipatti had in general in his playing and that characterized most of his playing until his final illness.
This is Chopin Opus 34 number 1, played by Dinu Lipatti in 1947, recorded in EMI studios. And let's compare it to his famous studio recording that we heard a minute of earlier. He definitely put his feet up on the table in that last climax before the coda with the extra bass note in the bottom there.
I mean, it's a whole other story. It doesn't sound like the same pianist, almost, except it does. You can hear the same transparency. You can hear the same attention to detail and clarity and layered voicing. And a lot of the details are the same, but the overall, emotional and energetic framework seems really quite different. The famous 1950 cycle, it's a little bit like, you can imagine these waltzes in a Bridgerton kind of setting, where everybody's very, very elegant and composed and, dancing in a very formal way. And so there's a little bit of freedom and there's grace and elegance and high class and all of that. And this one is more like, this one of those people with a certain sensitivity. You get on a horse and, you're racing through the forest. And there's, not everybody who's dancing in the ballroom is going to do that. And here we hear that side of Lipatti that's very different. It's dashing, daring, virile, really assertive and bold. Some of those are not words that one would generally associate with Lipatti based on his more famous recordings having been made in the final year of his life when he was not well, and also the conditions in which those were made. So those final recordings were made in a Swiss radio studio. So because Lipatti was so sick, he wasn't able to travel much. And finally, his doctor got in touch with Walter Legg at EMI and said, listen, you should really record him in Switzerland. Just bring some equipment and do the recordings here. And so EMI had this van of recording equipment that was in Prad recording the Casals Festival in 1950. And that drove then to Geneva. And they set up outside Radio Geneva and they had a studio there and they had all these cables and everything going from this recording van into this small constricted studio. So not as spacious, not as aerated as what we had at EMI. So there's automatically that. Lipatti did have two pianos available for those 1950 recordings. There was a full concert grand and there was a shorter piano. Those experts that I've consulted all believe that he's actually playing the larger piano for the Chopin. The discussion that I heard from some notes written by one of the engineers who I unfortunately wasn't able to speak with before he died, he did note that there was discussion about recording using the shorter piano for the Bach pieces. Whether they did or not, there isn't the documentation, unfortunately. It sounds almost like he's playing on a smaller piano because there simply isn't the grand, reverberance. His pupil Belashiki was actually at some of the recordings and he was like pushing against the studio door where there were cables going underneath to try to prevent any outside noise from coming in while he was making some of these recordings. So it was not done in pristine conditions, but of course it was an opportunity to capture Lipatti in, the twilight of his life. And certainly those recordings carry, we can see by their popularity, 75 years later, they are still incredibly esteemed. So there's no doubt that, his cycle of Chopin waltzes is justly the reference recording. And when you listen to that 1947 version, one definitely wonders, what would it be like if he had recorded the complete Chopin waltzes when he was in that vibrant health in that sort of, more professionally designed studio.
So this was July 1950, and he passes away a few months later. And maybe 2 months before his passing, he gives a final recital, and there's some waltzes on this.
Mesdames, Messieurs, ce récital de piano donné par Dinu Lipatti en la salle du Parlement à l'occasion du Festival international de musique de Besançon va prendre fin avec l'audition intégrale des 14 valses de Chopin.
Can you tell us a little bit about this final recital? When is it? What are the conditions? What is the atmosphere like there? Does he know this is it? just tell us about this like really poignant recording in the history of piano.
Yeah, it really was. This his final recital was given on September 16th, 1950, in the Besançon Music Festival. I think it was only the third festival that had been given there. Now, he was doing okay the morning of the recital, and he seemed to be in okay health. And then, things just really came and went. His condition was really unstable. And so the recital was being recorded for broadcast. And because of his health, they decided not to broadcast live, but they would broadcast it later. And so French, radio folks were on hand and people started arriving. Lipatti's name was such that it was reported that even when his concerts were canceled, people will hold onto their tickets rather than get a refund just in case there was this last minute chance that he would show up. So in Besançon, he was at the hotel. He was really unwell. The recital was supposed to start at 5:00, and word reaches him by 3:00. The hall was full, and folks are spilling out of the hall and down the staircase. I mean, it was completely full. And Lipatti hears this, and he's like, "Okay, I have to go." And they're saying maybe he'll just play the first half. We'll see. So he, walks slowly. He goes there, gets up the stairs. I've been to the hall. I mean, you have to go up this flight of stairs, no elevators, right? Much of Europe. And there was a back room where he would receive cortisone injections. He had to be injected at least once between each part of the recital. So he played a Bach section, he played the Bach Partita, the Mozart Sonata, 2 Schubert Impromptus, and after intermission, he'd programmed the 14 waltzes. When he created this program in early 1949, he called it his less tiring program. So that was the intent, was for him to be able to preserve his energy enough. And so it wasn't quite as demanding, which again, I think leads into that myth of, that Lipatti was always this kind of small-scale, weak, ill pianist. So he was really, really sick. And it's only recently that photos of the recital have been published. And Michel Musy was a French photographer who lived locally, and he took photos on one of those really old, look-down kind of cameras. And he took 8 photographs inside the hall. And the atmosphere, you can see occasionally a serene look on Lipatti's face and occasionally a really pained look. But the look of the audience is so unbelievably focused. And the people I spoke to who were present said that the atmosphere was absolutely indescribable. When he played the waltzes in concert, and you'll notice the same thing on recording, he doesn't play them sequentially. And his reasoning here was that Chopin didn't write them really as a group. Right? He Opus 18, and you have Opus 34, 1, 2, and 3, and then you have Opus, so you have this whole series of waltzes. He said it's not like playing the etudes, which were published as a set, or the preludes. And so his intent was to create a story and to shift between these different moods and atmospheres. And he would always end with Opus 34, number 1, which was kind of his singular Chopin waltz, his signature waltz. And so that was the one that he had programmed at the end of the Besançon recital, and where he was too weak to continue. And so he played, and we can hear in the recording he gives a really pretty rip-roaring account given his poor health on this Gaveau piano, Opus 18, right? The other Grande Valse Brillante. tremendous applause afterwards. The audience was probably, you know what it's like when you're in a recital and you're sitting and counting, has he gone through all of them? And so they probably thought it was the end, and they all burst into applause. And what we don't have is the recording of what followed. And I've been on the hunt, and whether it was actually recorded. It certainly wasn't broadcast, but Lipatti apparently played the opening notes of Opus 34, number 1, stopped, and walked away, and went into the back room. And probably received another injection. But the audience said it seemed interminable, like how long they were waiting, and they just kept waiting. And eventually he came out. And apparently he didn't play just one Bach encore, he played 3. So this is, again, sort of what's been shared is generally not what actually happened. But it was very, very moving. There is no recording. It would be, of course, incredibly moving to be able to hear, this unbelievably, sad story of, what was happening for him. And yet the playing itself, the entire recital, is utterly remarkable. It's also worth noting that EMI didn't want to release the recital recording. They actually kicked up a bit of a fuss. They weren't fully on board with the historical nature of it. They just said, well, the sound's not as good, and we have him already playing most of those pieces, so they just put out the Schubert impromptus, which Lipatti hadn't recorded in the studio, and they just said, well, we'll just keep issuing the other one. When Angel Records was founded in the United States as an offshoot of EMI, that was an opportunity for them to get a Lipatti exclusive in the United States, because the Columbia label in the United States had the rights to Lipatti's studio recordings. So they say, hey, okay, let's do the last recital, in the US, and then we can make some extra money. And then it was on the cover of Saturday Review magazine. It was just got rave reviews, and it's been called, one of the most important classical music live concert recordings ever. And they're like, okay. And so then it was issued everywhere in the world, and it's been seen as a hallmark ever since. So that's some of the background, technically, as well as, where Lipatti was in his life. He was very, very unwell while he was giving this concert. And there's a couple of waltzes where you can hear a rare flub where he just, drops some notes and, doesn't hold a passage together. But in general, the playing it's very emotional. It's much deeper.
I thought we could share one waltz from that final performance and sort of visit this room and this atmosphere. I think we should choose the appropriately somber A minor waltz, Opus 34, number 2. Chopin referred to it as Valse Melancholique to a student. And could you tell us a little bit about this particular piece, what we're about to hear?
People, again, who I spoke to who were there, spoke of this, very deep spiritual presence. And Nadia Boulanger said that the moment Lipatti walked on stage, it felt like the spiritual atmosphere in the room completely raised. But here he was, physically struggling. The microphone was placed under the piano, not the best place for it. We're also listening to an old tape that was just recently remastered. And so there's a little bit of background, what we sometimes term as artifacts. You might hear some pre-echoes for other music and, what's coming ahead. And some deterioration of the tape led to a little bit of some of that background noise. But if you tune into the signal of Lipatti's playing, you will hear some very exquisite and very moving pianism.
Here's Dinu Lipatti, Opus 34, number 2 of Chopin Waltz in his final recital. Not much you could say after that.
There's something about Lipatti's playing that does that. You're just like, well, that's just it. And,
Mhm.
the experience is so full spectrum, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, spiritually, if we can say, it just hits you on all the levels. And when you know the background, you listen through the sonic imperfections, and that's what we do with historical recordings in general, because the musical message, the signal is more important than the noise. And with Lipatti, he seemed to, as Leon Fleischer said, he was somebody who tuned into the signal of what the composer was intending to communicate to the heart of the music so well. And he communicates that with such mastery that it just leaves you like Cortot. I mean, the 16-year-old, 17-year-old Lipatti playing for the great Cortot, and he's sitting there speechless, saying, what could I say?
So why don't we end on a more upbeat note, and we'll return to that studio recording, and this time we'll listen to a full waltz from that 1950 summer session in Switzerland. Thanks for listening to the Chopin podcast. If you like what I do, consider supporting my Patreon, where I've been posting bonus content with many of the guests who've appeared in this series. For this episode, that includes lengthy supercuts of scenes from my interviews with Garrick Olson and Mark Ainley that didn't make the cut, as well as some short and fun exchanges with Stephen Huff. On the next episode of the Chopin podcast, we turn to a much more private and soul-searching dance genre, the first of 2 episodes on Chopin's mazurkas. As always, the episode will star Garrick Olson and feature Jed Disler's recording recommendations, and will also be joined by special guest Jerome Lowenthal, reacting to select mazurkas made by different 20th century pianists, including his teacher, the legendary William Capell. Stay tuned.